The air inside the orphanage buzzed with excitement. Laughter and the sound of small feet tapping against the wooden floors filled the brightly decorated room. Balloons floated near the ceiling, and banners hung proudly with the words "Welcome President" written in bold letters. The children, dressed in their best clothes, whispered among themselves, their eyes flickering to the large entrance doors. A few of the caretakers stood near the back, sharing hushed conversations. It was a rare occasion for someone of such stature to visit them, and even rarer for it to be someone as well known as him. Some of them exchanged glances, their faces a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Then it happened. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a creak. A hush fell over the room. The children's whispers died instantly as every small head turned toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped in, his signature suit and red tie unmistakable. A broad smile stretched across his face as he surveyed the room. Donald Trump had arrived. For a brief moment there was silence. Then a wave of energy surged through the orphanage as the children erupted into cheers and applause. Some of them ran forward, their little hands reaching out in excitement. The caretakers watched cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Trump chuckled, holding up his hands as if to calm the excited crowd. His eyes twinkled with amusement as he looked down at the children surrounding him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly wrapped gift, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is for you kids," he said, his voice carrying warmth. "But what's inside will surprise you." The children gasped, their curiosity piqued. They had received gifts before, but something about this moment felt different. Special. But as he began handing out the mysterious packages, one of the caretakers frowned. Something about this felt off. Then one of the children opened their gift. And everything changed. The little boy, no older than 8, sat cross-legged on the floor, his fingers trembling with anticipation as he peeled away the wrapping. The other children leaned in, their eyes wide, their breaths held as the shiny plastic fell away, revealing what lay inside. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It was colorful, wrapped tightly in some kind of transparent covering. Little figurines? No, they were too oddly shaped. Small pieces of something frozen in place like... His smile faltered. He turned the object over in his hands, his fingers brushing against the hardened surface. It felt smooth, almost too smooth. His brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of what he was holding. The room was still buzzing with excitement. More children tore into their gifts, unwrapping identical objects. Brightly colored, tightly sealed, strange. Some of them laughed, shaking the objects in their hands. Others exchanged confused looks, their excitement slowly waning. One of the caretakers, a woman with short gray hair and tired eyes, stepped forward, kneeling beside the boy. She took the gift from his hands, examining it closely. Her smile, warm and practiced, began to fade as her fingers traced the surface. She had seen many toys in her years working at the orphanage. But this was different. She glanced up at Trump, who was watching with a knowing smile, his hands clasped behind his back. What are these?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Trump chuckled, his eyes gleaming. "Gifts. Special gifts." The caretaker's grip on the object tightened. She turned it over again, squinting at the small, twisted shapes inside. A sick feeling crept up her spine. Then a little girl gasped. She cried, pointing at her gift. "There's something inside." The room shifted. The excitement turned into murmurs of unease as the children held up their gifts, peering closer. That's when they saw it. Tiny, frozen inside the plastic-like substance were small figures. Some looked like dolls but not quite. Their faces were too detailed. Their eyes, though miniature, seemed too real. Their mouths, barely visible, were slightly open as if frozen in mid-scream. The caretaker's breath caught in her throat. She looked back at Trump, expecting an explanation, a laugh, anything that would make sense of what she was seeing. But he just smiled. "Do you like them?" he asked, his voice warm. The children were no longer laughing. Some of them held their gifts at arm's length, their fingers curling away as if the objects burned to the touch. "They're not toys," one of the older children murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The caretaker's hands trembled. Her mind raced. She knew she had to do something. But before she could move, before she could gather the children, Trump took a step forward. "Let me tell you a little secret," he said, lowering his voice. The room fell silent. "These gifts are special," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, "because they hold something very rare, very precious." He reached down, picking up one of the strange objects from a child's hands. He turned it over, his fingers caressing the surface like a prized possession. "These," he said, "contain memories." The caretaker felt her stomach drop. "Memories?" she echoed, barely able to get the word out. Trump nodded, still smiling. Pieces of people. Pieces of the past. Moments frozen in time. He held the object up to the light, and for the first time the caretaker saw it clearly. The tiny, frozen figures inside weren't just dolls. They were people. Not figurines. Not toys. Real people. Trapped. The realization hit like a freight train, and a shudder ran through the room. Some of the children dropped their gifts, the plastic clattering against the floor. Others clutched them tighter, as if afraid of what might happen if they let go. The caretaker shot to her feet, her heart pounding. This isn't right. These aren't. Trump cut her off with a raised hand. His voice was calm, too calm. No need to be frightened, he said soothingly. These gifts are priceless. They are the essence of those who once were. The forgotten ones. Now they live on in the hands of these wonderful children. He turned to the room, his voice lifting. You see, every soul deserves to be remembered. Even if only as a keepsake. A suffocating silence fell over the orphanage. The children, the caretakers, even the air itself seemed frozen in place. Then one of the lights flickered. A slow, rhythmic creaking sound echoed from the far end of the room. A rocking chair, empty, moving on its own. And then, a whisper. Soft. Almost imperceptible. But there. Help us. The caretaker's breath hitched. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room, the walls, the ceiling. The children clung to each other now, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Trump remained calm, his smile never faltering. The gifts are waking up, he said, almost to himself. Then the whispers grew louder. Help us. Please. Let us out. The plastic objects in the children's hands began to vibrate. A low, humming noise filled the air, growing stronger with each second. The caretaker grabbed one of the gifts from the floor, turning it in her hands. The tiny figures inside, their faces were changing. Their eyes, once frozen in fear, were now moving. Blinking. Looking around. One of them turned its head. Its mouth moved, and though no sound escaped, she knew exactly what it was saying. Help. The children began screaming. The gifts trembled violently in their hands, the plastic-like material cracking, splintering. Dark shadows flickered against the walls, twisting and stretching, taking form. Trump watched it all, his expression unreadable. Then he took a deep breath and whispered a single word. Enough. Instantly the room fell silent. The shadows vanished. The whispers stopped. The vibrating objects stilled. The plastic remained cracked, but nothing moved inside anymore. The children sobbed quietly, clutching each other. The caretaker stood in stunned horror. Trump exhaled as if satisfied. He turned to the caretaker, his smile returning. They belong to you now, he said softly. Take care of them. And with that he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The caretaker could only watch as he left, the echo of his footsteps disappearing down the hallway. Then, as the door clicked shut behind him, one of the little girls whimpered. The whispers, they're still here. The room remained eerily silent after Trump left. The children huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, clutching the strange, cracked gifts in their trembling hands. The caretaker stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The old woman, the head caretaker, swallowed hard. Her fingers curled around one of the fractured objects, still warm from the energy it had radiated moments ago. She turned it over, inspecting the now motionless figures trapped inside. They weren't moving anymore. But their expressions, their tiny, frozen faces, remained locked in silent screams. Then the whispers returned. At first they were barely audible, like a faint breeze moving through the orphanage. But slowly they grew louder, distinct voices overlapping, crying, pleading. Help us. Please. Let us out. We are still here. The light overhead flickered, and the air in the room grew heavy, thick with something unseen yet suffocating. The head caretaker turned sharply, scanning the dimly lit space. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, twisting in ways that defied logic. And then, a knock. Soft, deliberate. Coming from the far end of the orphanage, down the hallway where Trump had exited. The children whimpered, pulling closer to each other. One of the younger caretakers, a man in his early 30s, took a cautious step forward. I'll check it out, he stammered. His voice betrayed his fear, but he forced himself to move. As he reached the doorway, the knocking ceased. The hallway was empty. Then a chill ran down his spine as he saw it. Footsteps. Wet, muddy, leading away from the door, but they didn't belong to Trump. They were smaller. Barefoot. As if a dozen unseen children had walked through, leaving behind their silent, ghostly trail. He turned back to the room, his voice unsteady. We need to get rid of those things. No. The head caretaker nodded, urgency replacing her fear. She grabbed one of the cracked gifts and hurried toward the old fireplace in the center of the orphanage. The embers still glowed faintly from earlier that evening. Without hesitation, she threw the object into the flames. The reaction was immediate. A scream, high-pitched, agonized, ripped through the air. The fire flared violently, turning an unnatural shade of blue. The shadows on the walls convulsed as if writhing in pain. The children screamed, covering their ears. The other caretaker staggered back, eyes wide in terror. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The fire returned to normal. The shadows stilled. The gift was gone, reduced to nothing but ash. The head caretaker turned to the others. Burn them. Burn them all. One by one, the caretakers gathered the strange objects and threw them into the fire. Each time, the same tortured scream echoed through the orphanage. Each time, the fire roared, flared, and then dimmed. The children sobbed as their gifts were destroyed, torn between fear and an unexplainable attachment to the eerie objects. And then, when the last one was burned, a deafening silence settled over the room. The air felt lighter. The weight of the unseen presence was gone. The flickering light finally steadied. The whispers had stopped. For the first time that night, the caretakers allowed themselves to breathe. It was over. Or so they thought. One of the children, a little boy with tear-streaked cheeks, clutched something in his hands. A single, unburned gift. He looked up, his lip trembling. "They told me not to let go," he whispered. The head caretaker's heart nearly stopped. Before she could move, the plastic in the boy's hands cracked open on its own. A dense, black mist seeped out, curling through the air like living tendrils. The boy gasped as it wrapped around his fingers, climbing up his arm. His body stiffened, his eyes rolling back as his mouth fell open in a silent scream. The caretakers rushed forward, but it was too late. The mist poured into the boy's mouth, disappearing into him. And then, he exhaled. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. But they weren't his eyes anymore. They were ancient, hollow, filled with something else. The boy's lips parted, and when he spoke, his voice was layered, his own but also many others speaking in unison. "We are free." A slow, eerie smile spread across his face. "And now, we are home." The candles in the room extinguished all at once. The fire in the hearth died. The shadows on the walls moved again, this time without a source. The orphanage plunged into darkness. And the last thing the head caretaker heard was the laughter. Dozens of voices, echoing from the walls, from the ceilings, from the very foundation of the orphanage. Not the laughter of the living, but the laughter of those who had finally returned.